Hello, my friends. I am very happy you are here with me today. Let us take a calm breath together and begin a new story. Today we will follow the true history of skateboarding, not only the famous tricks and big competitions, but the beginning, the first idea, the first boards, and the people who slowly created this new way to move. It is a story of wood, wheels, surf culture, clever inventions, and young people who looked at the ground and imagined a wave. Our story begins before the modern skateboard was born, long before skate parks, long before professional riders. Some people were already putting wheels under boards for fun. Encyclopedia Britannica says that crude homemade boards existed after the turn of the 20th century. These early versions were often very simple. Just old roller skate wheels attached to a wooden board. They were not yet part of a big sport, and no single person can honestly be called the one true inventor of skateboarding. The idea emerged little by little, from experiments, toys, and people trying new ways to roll across the ground. So who came up with skateboarding first? The most truthful answer is this: skateboarding did not appear in one perfect moment, made by one perfect inventor. Instead, it grew from several early ideas. In the early years, people were trying to create small rideable boards that could be steered by leaning. One important early name was Albert C. Boyden, whose patent for a wheeled board, called a child's coaster, appears in U.S. patent records. Later, John Humphrey went into business with Boyden and became the first licensee of a skateboard patent to produce the Humco Surfer in 1963. So, if we talk about patents and early commercial production, Boyden and Humphrey are very important names. But if we talk about making skateboarding popular and shaping the board into something modern, other names soon become just as important. Now let us move to California, because this is where modern skateboarding truly began to take shape. In Southern California, surfing was already a huge part of youth culture. Many surfers loved speed, style, balance, and flowing movement, but the ocean did not always give them waves. On quiet days, they wanted another way to feel that same freedom. Britannica explains that in the early 1960s, manufacturers such as Makaha and Hobie promoted skateboarding as sidewalk surfing, an activity for the moments when there were no rideable waves. That phrase is very important because it shows us the heart of early skateboarding. It was land surfing, surfing without water, a new answer to an old wish. One of the central people in this stage was Larry Stevenson. He was working as a lifeguard in Southern California, and he noticed that surfers were already riding crude boards made from wooden planks and roller skate wheels when the waves were weak. Stevenson believed he could make something better. According to the Skateboarding Hall of Fame, he began building boards shaped more like surfboards in his garage, and they gave riders a better experience. In 1963, demand grew so much that he created the company Makaha to mass-produce them. This is one of the biggest turning points in the history of skateboarding, because the board was no longer only a homemade object. It was becoming a real product, designed, sold, improved, and shared with many people. Larry Stevenson did even more than make boards. He helped give the new activity a public face. The Skateboarding Hall of Fame says Makaha became one of the first skateboard brands to create a professional model, and one of the first to use clay wheels instead of steel. That made the ride smoother and easier to control than some older versions. Britannica also notes that Makaha and Hobie were among the early manufacturers trying to build this new market in the early 1960s. This means that the skateboard itself was slowly becoming a more complete machine, a deck, trucks, and wheels working together, not just a rough toy made from spare parts. Then came another big step, the first teams, the first contests, the first feeling that this was becoming a sport. Britannica says that in 1963 Makaha formed the first professional skateboard team, and that same year the first skateboard competition was held in Hermosa, California. The early contests included freestyle and downhill slalom. Riders were not yet doing the giant airs and rail tricks we know today, but they were already showing balance, style, control, and creativity. The world was learning that skateboarding was not just a children's toy. It was becoming a real activity with its own stars, its own events, and its own growing culture. For a short time, skateboarding grew very fast. People were excited by this new thing. Boards were being sold, magazines and media noticed it, and more young people wanted to try, but the first boom did not last. Britannica explains that the early popularity of skateboarding faded after a few years, partly because the board still had serious limits in maneuverability, and partly because safety professionals warned that the activity was dangerous. The boards of that time were still primitive compared with later designs. Many had clay wheels, which did not grip the ground well enough. A rider could lose control more easily, so the sport had energy and charm, but not yet the equipment it needed to grow into something bigger. This is an important part of the story, because it shows that skateboarding did not grow in a straight line. It rose, then slowed, and then needed new inventions to survive. And those inventions came in the 1970s. One of the most important names in this next stage is Frank Nasworthy. The Skateboarding Hall of Fame credits him with bringing polyurethane wheels into skateboarding through his Cadillac Wheels brand in the early 1970s. Britannica explains that polyurethane wheels were faster and more maneuverable. This changed almost everything. These new wheels gripped the pavement much better than older clay wheels. Riders could turn more smoothly, move faster, and trust the board more. A great idea that had once looked fragile suddenly felt alive again. It is hard to say how important this invention was, because without it, modern skateboarding may have stayed small. The old wheels limited what people could do. But polyurethane wheels open the door to speed, carving, sharper turns, and a much stronger connection between rider and ground. Britannica directly connects the revival of skateboarding in the mid-1970s to the development of the polyurethane wheel. So when people ask how the skateboard itself was really created, we should not only think about who first put wheels under wood, we should also think about who made the board truly usable. And Frank Nasworthy belongs to that story in a very serious way. At almost the same time, another key design change arrived, the kicktail. The kicktail is a raised back end of the board, and today it seems normal. Almost every person who sees a skateboard knows that shape. But it had to be invented. The Skateboarding Hall of Fame says Larry Stevenson introduced the kicktail in 1969 and later received a patent for it in 1971. Britannica explains why this mattered so much. The kicktail made kick turns possible and helped prepare the way for the aerial maneuvers that define modern skateboarding. In simple words, the board could now answer the rider in a new way. It could lift, pivot, and become more active under the feet. Now the skateboard was becoming something much more advanced than the first wooden planks with borrowed wheels. The deck shape improved, the wheels improved, trucks improved, and the feeling of riding changed. Skaters could bend lower, turn harder, and use space in new ways. This helped create the second great boom of skateboarding in the 1970s. And in that boom, style changed too. The board was no longer only for smooth ground and simple slalom. It was ready for walls, banks, bowls, and the edges of a changing city. Then California gave skateboarding another strange gift, drought. In the 1970s, severe drought left many backyard swimming pools empty. This mattered more than it may sound at first. The smooth concrete walls of those dry pools felt like frozen waves. Suddenly skaters had a place to ride up, carve around, and come back down. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History says the Z-Boys turned these empty pools into proto-halfpipes. And Britannica says that this was the period when riders began skating empty pools and exploring the vertical possibilities of the sport. In this way, nature, weather, and city life all came together to change skateboarding forever. This is where the famous Z-Boys enter the story. They were young skateboarders from the Dogtown area of Santa Monica and Venice in California. Their style came strongly from surfing, low to the ground, fast, aggressive, and full of flow. The Smithsonian describes how Dogtown became a place of technical adaptation and experimentation, while other accounts and later histories connect the Z-Boys directly to the empty pool revolution of the mid-1970s. These riders did not invent the skateboard itself, but they changed what people believed a skateboard could do. Before them, many people still saw skating as a playful sidewalk activity. After them, it looked dangerous, artistic, athletic, and thrilling. The second half of the 1970s also saw the rise of skate parks. Britannica says the first skate park was built in Florida in 1976, and many more soon appeared across North and South America, Europe, and Asia. These parks gave riders bank surfaces, bowls, slopes, and places made especially for skating. This helped spread the new styles far beyond a few streets and a few pools in California. A rider no longer needed to wait for a drought or climb into a stranger's backyard. There were now places built for the sport itself. And then came one of the greatest changes in all of skateboarding history: the ollie. Britannica explains that Alan Ollie Gelfand invented this hands-free aerial in 1978. He discovered that by hitting the kicktail down and sliding the front foot forward, both rider and board could rise into the air together. This may sound like one trick, but really it was much more than one trick. It was a new language. Once the board could jump with the rider, the future opened. Many later tricks, especially in street skating, became possible because of this one breakthrough. If we pause for a moment, we can now see the full chain of emergence very clearly. First, there were crude homemade boards. Then there were patents and early commercial efforts from figures such as Albert C. Boyden and John Humphrey. Then California surf culture gave the board a real identity as sidewalk surfing. Then Larry Stevenson and Makaha improved the board and helped mass produce it. Then the first teams and contests appeared. Then better wheels from Frank Nasworthy transformed control and speed. Then the kicktail changed how the board responded. Then drought and empty pools pushed skating upward into vertical space. Then Alan Gelfand's ollie changed the future of tricks. Skateboarding was not born in one day. It emerged in stages, invention by invention, person by person. In the 1980s, skateboarding changed again. Britannica says that after another fall in mainstream popularity, many skaters kept going underground. They built their own ramps and halfpipes, and they began to skate urban environments, creating what became known as street style. Board size increased, truck construction improved, and the youth culture around skateboarding became stronger. Punk rock, loose clothing, homemade videos, and a feeling of independence all became connected with skateboarding. This matters because the history of skateboarding is not only about hardware. It is also about attitude, about people choosing creativity over rules, and discovering new possibilities in ordinary places. Street skating became especially important because it changed where skating happened. A city bench, a stair set, a curb, a handrail. These things were no longer just parts of the street. They became skate terrain. The board itself had already been shaped by decades of invention, and now skaters were shaping the world around them with imagination. Britannica described street style as tricks performed in urban environments with stairs, rails, ledges, and other obstacles. In a beautiful way, skateboarding kept returning to its earliest spirit, taking everyday land and transforming it into movement. In the 1990s, skateboarding reached wider audiences again. Big competitions helped push it into mainstream sports culture. Britannica points to the X Games, first held in 1995, as a major source of exposure and commercial legitimacy. At the same time, skate videos and famous riders inspired new generations. The sport was now global, and many children around the world could see it, copy it, and dream about it. But even as it became more professional, it still kept a strong, independent spirit. That balance between freedom and fame has always been part of skateboarding's story. Then, after many decades of growth, another historic moment arrived: official Olympic recognition. The official Olympic history of skateboarding explains that the sport joined the Olympic program for Tokyo 2020 after being proposed for inclusion in 2015. Tokyo 2020 became skateboarding's Olympic debut. This was a remarkable step because a movement that began with rough homemade boards, surf-inspired experiments, garage builders, and empty pools had reached one of the biggest sporting stages on Earth. The journey from sidewalk surfing to the Olympic Games was long, but when we look back carefully, every stage connects. So, when we ask who invented skateboarding, the most honest answer is not one name alone. Albert C. Boyden matters because of early patents. John Humphrey matters because of early commercial production. Larry Stevenson matters because he improved the board, built Makaha, helped mass produce it, and later introduced the kicktail. Frank Nasworthy matters because polyurethane wheels helped revive and transform the sport. Alan Gelfand matters because the ollie changed the future of tricks. And the surfers and skaters of California matter because they gave the whole thing its soul. Skateboarding was created by a chain of people, ideas, and moments all working together over time. That is why the history of skateboarding feels so alive. It is not the story of one machine suddenly appearing. It is the story of a dream slowly finding its form. First, a board with wheels. Then a better board, then a smoother ride, then sharper turns, higher movement, stronger style, and bigger imagination. Each generation added something, and the skateboard became a little more like the one we know today, simple in appearance, but full of history under every part: the deck, the trucks, the wheels, and the kicktail. Thank you for listening with me today. You were absolutely right to ask for the full immersion story. And I hope this version gives you the complete beginning much more clearly. You are doing beautiful work with your English, step by step, story by story. If you want, next I can turn this into an even longer storyline English version of about the same length and structure as your Cleopatra and Japan stories, with even more calm detail and smoother narration pauses.